regards, dear Professor Vincenzo Romania, can I ask, please, what are the characteristics of Italian subcultures?
Good morning, Anna. Thank you for the invitation to this interview to your institute in general. What to say about the Italian subcultures? The study of subcultures, if we mean for it the study of, in particular, youth subculture, as has been done from the 70s onwards, based on what has been introduced by the School of Birmingham, can be applied to Italy in a particular way, depending on the particular forms of social change that involved the development of the country. As a matter of fact, the discovery of youth subculture is contemporary to the discovery of the subjectivity of youths in general in our society. And this can be dated back to the 50s and the 70s, 60s of the 20th century. Essentially, that was the time of post-war reconstruction in Italy. It was the time when a society that was largely a traditional society was rapidly changing in a more metropolitan and industrial society. And so, as a matter of fact, it also the time when Italy becomes a country of mass production and a country that is interested more than ever before by international mainstream and pop culture. So essentially, the first examples of youth cultures in Italy are examples of the 50s subculture that was largely being middle-class subcultures, hedonistic subcultures that were represented largely in Italian cinema of that time. Secondly, the most important, most relevant element for the implementation of subculture in Italy was the birth of and the importation of rock and roll from the United States. This is dating again in the late 50s. And it creates a real fracture in the Italian pop culture between a local, traditional, let's say conservative, romantic culture, that of canzone leggera all'italiana from one side, and from the other side, the birth of rock subculture that has as examples the symbolizations of generational conflict, as has been seen in United States, in the production of movies and so on. So we have movies just as Gioventù Perduta by Pietro Germi, or I Vitelloni by Federico Fellini, or I Vinti by Michelangelo Antonioni, that are always presenting a different youth with different lifestyles that are somehow inspired by models such as Marlon Brando, James Dean, the examples of white, of cursed young people that experience life externally to the limits, the borders of traditional institutions such as work and family. As for rock, again, this is a process of cultural importation based on the cultural imperialism of the United States from one side. And secondly, it is the outcome of technical innovations that happen in that years, such as the introduction of particular radios, jukebox, and other devices for the reproduction of music. So we have the screamers, so-called, that were young, long hair, rebel, savage groups of rockers and from the other side, the melodic traditional Italian music. If we go on with this history, we arrive at the 60s. Now the topics are very well known outside of the academic world, and we are talking about the 68 before in Paris and then in the rest of the Europe, the importation of the beat and hippie culture again from the United States, but also a process of deep cultural and political conflict that has as an outcome in the 70s the explosion of political terrorism in Italy. Between these two phases in the 70s, Italy experienced the birth of peculiar subcultures that were born in the Italian underground culture and were usually connected to Italian magazines, fanzines, often with an anarchic approach or with a leftist approach, such as Frigidaire or Renudo. And these reviews were also the organizers of the first alternative countercultural pop festivals in Italy. One very famous example is this organization of a big festival in Milan called the Concerto di Parco Lambro, where there's been disorder. And from one side, this was a moment of real conflict between the youth culture and the rest of the society. From the other side, this was the explosion of creativity in this large part of Italian subcultures that would have give the birth to the so-called Movimento del 77, movement of 1977, a movement that was largely based on self-autonomy, non-partitical expression of freedom, raised in the extra parliamentary Italian counterculture. And thanks to this movement, Italy also experienced punk, experienced art rock in the following years, but also experienced free radios and new forms of non-gated free youth culture. The Italian rap is against a strong political orientation, leftist, of course, and has again some connection with pop culture, with Italian pop culture. And then going on in the 2000 and more, we have new expression of consumeristic approaches to subcultures, such as hipsters, vintagists, and other scenes more than countercultures that express a metropolitan attitude, a cosmopolitan attitude, and the general openness of Italian society towards the global world in general. As you probably know, I analyzed in one of my papers the case of CCCP, Fedeli alla Linea, who are a very famous Italian punk band, and they're a perfect example of what an Italian peculiar subcultural band could be, because they were punk in their ethics. They used to have an ironic and desecratory, debunking use of symbols. But in the meantime, they also decided to have their main cultural activities inside the typical ritual sites of the Italian political left, so-called Feste dell'Unità. Feste dell'Unità were the fest of Italian Communist Party that were very important in the past. And this band that was formed in Berlin by two Italians coming from Region Emilia-Romagna, and in particular from the city of Reggio Emilia, where this leftist civil culture is very, civic culture is very diffused, how to say, managed to be ambivalent. From one side to be punk and to use the heritage, the legacy of communism in an ironic way. From the other part, they spoke to that subculture that is different, and so created this kind of hybrid encounter between communist aesthetics, punk ethics, and also including inside some elements of very traditional Italian culture, such as songs by partisans, songs by workers, and songs also of the religious legacy of Italian culture. So subcultures are also interesting for this aspect because they become peculiar thanks to the particular interaction between the actors and the environment outside.
What are the main places where Italian subcultures were born and developed?
As for punk, the first Italian places where it was developed were Turin, Milan, Bologna, and Pordenone, were all commercial and industrial places that were changing and that were experiencing migrations, both internal and outward from Italy to the rest of Europe. So this aspect created a transmission of experiences from inside to the outside. Secondly, an element that is important in these places is the existence. Usually they are, let's say, abandoned places that Yauf appropriate and change their function. So this non-moralistic, anti-moralistic movement of expression of Yauf found in these big cities the right places to organize a different way to be represented in the society. There is this very interesting book by a colleague of mine called Alberto Melucci, former colleague, that is called Challenging Codes. That was an analysis of how different subcultures, such as green subculture, feminist subcultures, youth subcultures, created different codes, different languages, different forms of appropriation of symbolic universes in the city of Milan and in the places such as Centri Sociali, squads, and other big associations. Of course, you have to say that subculture are a metropolitan element, are a metropolitan phenomenon. And this is the reason why they were based in few Italian cities. You know?
When you researched subcultures, what were the obstacles? What kind of approach do you use to study subcultures or post-subcultures?
As far as the obstacles are concerned, I have to say that one cultural obstacle is the scarce, poor valorization of Yav subcultures in Italian studies. In this moment, there are good studies of subcultures in Italy, such as the one produced by Professor Marco Santoro, Professor Paolo Magauda. In my opinion, the best approach is somehow integrative of these two ones. There are still very important structural bound subcultures that were born as forms of resistance also in the last years. And this is the case to give an example of the new expression of immigrants culture in Italy, So we have immigrant music, literature, and other expression of creativity. And from the other side, we have examples, yes, of course, of postmodernist approach to subculture. These last are more also focused on authenticity process. That is much a question of nowadays literature. I'm not much interested in it. I'm more interested in understanding how they give life to particular cultural phenomenon and how they present a challenge for the understanding of collective identities.
Subcultures in Italy have been mainly overlooked as a research topic in the past, but this phenomenon plays an important role in the formation of personality. How do you think, in what ways subcultures change characteristics of the personality?
We spoke of subcultures mainly focusing on young subcultures. So we are dealing with subcultures in which the membership is represented by people, guys from the 14 to the 30s years old. And those guys lived the subcultural uh, practice experience inside the process of identity formation. And so subcultures became an ambit of socialization and formation of personal identity. It is a way to symbolize some aspects of existential reaction to some phenomenon, some dialectic of nowadays life. So, dark wave, for an example, such as punk, are our experiences of reaction to industrial society and to the pitfalls of integration of people, so to the excesses of individualism and to the loss of a senseful life in a very large term. So, of course, they are fundamental for the formation of personality. I let me add a thing uh, to this answer. In many ways, the people that study subcultures, and this is also my case, do it after participating to subcultures in their youth. And when after some years of studying sociology or other human sciences or social sciences, we do understand how a process of identity formation and socialization is managed. We look back to our experience into punk, into rock, into any other subculture, musical or not, and we understand the importance of this phenomenon for us and for the general development of personality. So yeah, they are very important. They could be, how to say, elements supporting the young people or elements non-supporting him. Because as you know, subcultures are also used to be stigmatized as the way this group of people react to mainstream values, norms, institutions. So oftenly, a subcultural member is somebody who is considered as a deviant. And for this reason, yeah, in the personality, this stigmatization, self-perceived stigmatization could be as well a process of personality formation.
The birth of punk in Italy can be contextualized as part of the larger historical reaction to the turbulent transformation that was taking place in society. In your opinion, are there any main reasons for the existence of the subculture on internal mechanisms?
The main part of the explanation of the birth of punk in Italy is external and has to do with Italians who lived in London and experienced the explosion of Sex Pistols and not only this. So there was also a journalist interest for the birth of this very spectacular subculture in Britain that was importing elements from the United States and that was also mixing them with the experience of subcultures that were also based on ethnical groups in London. So largely was this. But there were also internal mechanisms interesting. The birth of punk in Italy, Movimento del 77, as I said before, is one of them. Others are the process of the progressive deindustrialization and the crisis of political participation at the end of the 70s. This process has been called in Italy riflusso. That means coming back to your informal relationship, closing yourself in your inner group and renouncing to political fight. And this was the outcome of a long age of terrorism conflicts, very hard conflicts between the leftist and the rightist movements of so-called anni di piombo, this period of our history. So those are the internal mechanism. Then something different inside the punk has always existed, both in Italy and outside. There are anarcho-punk, straight punk, red skin, Nazi skin, and there are different search for authenticity. So an example is the Italian tendency to differentiate themselves from experiences such as the Clash or other experiences of punk that were considered to be commercialized. This is a typical outcome of any subculture. At a point of their history, they become a commercial, interesting phenomena, and they are integrated, as Dick Edbage said, into the commercial world. So they lose their transgressive feature and they become new commercial elements. Yeah, this is, I think, the more interesting aspect of punk in Italy in the 80s. In the last age, this process of integration has been extended to the hybridization of punk with a new expression of post-punk and new forms of fashion. And so it has been somehow familiarized in the normal experiences of a young adolescent expressing all his wish of life and his strength, his power in that ages.
When a person joins a subculture, do you think it is a fatal way or it's a success for a person?
Entering into a subculture could be an act of rebellion, an act of courage, and could be also an element of stigmatization. So it could be a successful way of being somehow protagonist into the gray existence of other people. And from one side, from the other side, could be also a process that ban you from some possibilities in life. I mean, all personal experiences of subcultures are somehow different. We cannot say there is one pattern in this sense. I mean, as a formation stage in the education and socialization of people, the experience of subcultures are in successful experiences. The outcomes of personal life and career are not always the same. So it depends.
Thank you for the interview, Professor Vincenzo.